Okay. Good morning and welcome. Of course, the 17 first-timers, it's wonderful to see you, but it's really good to see those of you who are here for the second time. And of course, first-timers, when you come again, you'll be really welcome, even though you're not first-timers anymore. So after all the fun I've had with my title CXO, some of you may have noticed that I'm now the CTO again. There's one more person we're missing this year. He didn't pass away, he was headhunted. So Jay Fode, you will have noticed, is no longer here, and I'm the CTO again. But since that's something I've been for most of my professional career, I can live with that. So my job is to try and really put into context most of the talks that you'll be hearing from other members of the Dyalog team later this week, and pretend there's a cunning plan behind it all. So to give you an overview of our strategy, our goals, and we're really here to make it easier for all of you. First of all, for the newcomers, we want to make it easier for people to discover APL and get hold of it, as Gitta was talking about, making it easier to download. Once you're in, we want to make it easier for you to create and, of course, deploy the solutions that you make in APL. We want to give you all the tools that you need to be competitive while you're doing that, so you can compete with solutions developed using other tool stacks. It's important that your solutions are not just standalone solutions, but can be integrated. So your solutions need to be integrated with other applications, other development frameworks. And of course, something that's really becoming a big focus now is the development process, that if you're developing things in Dyalog APL and maybe using other tools as well, you've got some HTML, some CSS, some JavaScript, etc. It's really important that you can integrate Dyalog APL into whatever greater development processes that you have in your organization. And of course, once you've built the systems, you need to easily be able to maintain not just your own code, but also the APL system itself. So we're working hard to make it easier to update your APL system and keep it running. And of course, at the end of the day, it's all about, well, at least for us, having fun and making money. So I'm going to dive into each one of those a little bit more and talk about things we've done recently and things that are about to come that you'll hear more about in talks this week. So making it easier to discover and learn APL is actually something that we're spending a growing amount of time on. One of the things that's been really successful is Adam's work in Stack Exchange. I don't know how many people have been to this site. Oh, that's better than last time. So this is really taking off, and we've had benefits from this. We've hired somebody who came to us from this. And it's really a place that I would recommend also those of you who are out to recruit young talent. You should have somebody present here answering questions, listening to what's going on, and seeing who looks like they're any good. So one of our new consultants in the US, Nathan, came to us through the Orchard. One of the other things that we think is important in terms of attracting new people is making sure that APL code starts appearing out there on the internet where people are looking. So open source APL projects, and those are also starting to rapidly increase. I think there are now at least 100 different GitHub projects containing APL code, and that's really a curve that's going up. So Acre Desktop from our friends at the Carlyle Group, a project management system, and of course all of the code that we now write at Dyalog in APL. So not the C interpreter, we haven't yet figured out how we could open source that. Maybe it'll happen one day. But every line of APL code that we write pretty much ends up as open source on GitHub. We're making all of the tools available as collaborative projects, and really happy to see that some of the customers are really getting engaged in that as well. We're not doing all of the coding anymore. So here's a screenshot of our own GitHub repository. The first one there, Tamstat, you'll see is private. That's something you can't see. That's something we're working on internally that we will make public. And then we've got my server and link, and I can't remember how many there are now, probably 50 or 60 public projects from us. Another group that really is starting to post a significant number of GitHub projects is the Carlyle group. Acre Desktop, Rumba is a web framework, both client and server tools to make it easier to do TCP stuff. It's really good to see that, and we're really happy to participate in those projects and maybe even co-fund some of them. Webinars and webcasts. We've been doing webinars now for nearly 2 years. Richard Park, who's here, joined us late last year. He's becoming the driving force at Dyalog for those. We can see him here a few weeks ago talking about molecular dynamics with the Jupyter Notebook, showing how to do cool things in APL. That's something that, again, we're putting more and more time into. So there's going to be, I've tried to, in each one of these sections, list some of the most directly related talks that you'll see later this week. So Richard is going to redo some of his molecular dynamics stuff tomorrow evening at 8. Adam is going to talk about ideas for finding ways to do things in APL. So far, I think our reference material is reasonably good if you want to find out how dyadic IOTA works. Most people know how to do that. But if you want to know how to read data from a particular file format, Adam's working on new ways for people to ask questions like that and get answers. And Richard's going to be back on Thursday talking about creating Jupyter notebooks. And of course, we're slowly increasing the number of talks that members of the Dyalog team do outside the APL community. So in particular, this year, Marshall and Aaron have already been to LambdaConf in Boulder. Marshall, Aaron, and myself are heading for Bangalore again in November to speak at Functional Conf. And we're doing an increasing number of lectures at various universities. So this is me in the outfit. Daval here on the left has been running something he calls Code Jugalbandi, which means jam session in Indian music. And he's picked various developers through the years that he's thought were doing interesting things, and then he'll do this jam session where, in this case, he did something this is a Mars rover we were simulating. You can see the track here of how the Mars rover was moving through the landscape in a non-looping solution written in APL. And Daval will do the same thing in JavaScript or one of the functional programming languages. And then we'll have this to and fro. And it's very, very popular. It's one of the most popular sessions in Bangalore when we do these things. It's quite entertaining. So that's a lot of fun. I'm doing it again this year. That's in 8 days. Poughkeepsie, Marist College, the ACM chapter there is hosting a talk on APL. So we're trying to get the word out, as Gita said, spread the gospel. And anybody who's involved in an APL user group anywhere in the world, if you're organizing a meetup or you'd like a speaker from Dyalog, I mean, almost anywhere, right? Even Australia. You can probably attract us. Actually, it's a long time since we've been in Australia, New Zealand. It's time for a trip out there. Dyalog will send somebody, almost guaranteed. Yeah, we'd like to come to Australia in February. Yeah. Anyway, so Gita talked a bit about this. It's really important to make it easier to get hold of APL. We're finding it's actually, if you go to functional programming conferences in particular, it's quite easy to get people interested in APL. But then we've found that this barrier of having to sign up to get hold of a copy of APL is really a problem. You can play with TryAPL, and I think Richard Park is working on a Jupyter notebook server that will be running permanently, where you can go in and execute APL expressions in Jupyter notebooks. But the most important thing, and one of the reasons why version 17.1 was late, and in fact, Gita said we didn't get it all done, we're going to have to finish this work when we get back home, is to make Dyalog APL available for non-commercial use on Windows, Linux, and Mac without any form of registration. So you'll just be able to go to the Dyalog page and get hold of a copy, download it, and be running in minutes. And if minutes is not good enough, and you have Docker installed, then you'll be able to do it in seconds just by typing docker run dialog/dialog and the name of a file containing some APL code that you want to run, and it will fire up a Docker container and run your code. And as Gitta pointed out, making the Docker containers available has been one of the primary drivers also for making it unregistered, so that people will be able to fire up, Lambda functions in the Amazon framework based on Dyalog APL without having to fill in forms. Yeah. So in addition to just the basic Dyalog container, which contains the Linux, a really minimalistic Linux system, only just enough that's required to run Dyalog APL, there are also containers that have some of our server frameworks pre-installed. So you can get containers with my server, with the Jupyter Notebook framework, the JSON server, and Brian's latest work, the REST server, which is a very simple framework for just throwing APL functions into a RESTful web server. Those are available as Docker containers that you can just add a few files to and be running. But it's important to note it's not free software, even though you can now very easily get hold of it. And this Windows, Linux, Mac is really getting important. So here's an email we got not very long ago. And the young person, I believe, says, I regularly use and develop for all three systems, Windows, Linux, Mac OS. I would appreciate a license for all three. And in the past, our admin team would have had to deal with 3 different applications and send this person links. In the future, hopefully we will eventually hear from this person, right? The thing that worries us, of course, is people are going to be using the system, we won't know about it, and we won't have any opportunities to interact with them. But of course, the way things work today, you have to accept that, and if they get excited, they'll post stuff on GitHub, and then you'll learn about it when they start using it. So here's just a screenshot of the Docker Hub, as it's called. A bit like GitHub, there's a repository where companies put their Docker images. So here's the Jupyter framework, which had 72 downloads, and my server, which had, nearly 1,000 downloads. So once you've got hold of it and you've written your application, of course, it needs to be easier also to get your application out there. So work we've done in version 17.1, the Docker containers that we've talked about, we've spent quite a bit of work on supporting APL running headless. So that means APL running in a Docker container or on a Windows server that doesn't have a terminal attached. And there's work we've done to make sure that APL runs smoothly in those circumstances and uses less, doesn't allocate GUI resources, for example, allows you to run a much higher number of service processes under Windows. And of course the work on RIDE, the remote debugger, so that you can always easily connect to a headless interpreter and debug it if you need to, if you've set up the firewalls and the security. Work that we're doing in version 18 to make this even easier. One of the big problems now, if you really want to write an application and distribute it to multiple platforms, or say develop it under Windows and deploy it under Linux, is the way that the interpreter and applications typically get configured is different from one platform to the next. You've got the registry on Windows, you've got environment variables on Linuxes, and we're working on a way to create a configuration file that Dyalog APL and applications written in Dyalog APL can use, where the same configuration file can just be shipped to any platform. So you can use that file to develop on Windows and just ship it to a Docker container with Linux, and it'll all work. And There's a lot of work that's been done. There'll be several talks on this week about the importance of getting your APL source code into text files so that you can use Git and GitHub and so on. And there's a small corner still missing where you really need an APL workspace, a binary workspace, to launch your application. With version 18, it's our goal that you'll be able to write an application entirely using text files, and that will also allow you to launch it. So the APL interpreter will be able to run from an application which is only consists of textual source files. So Richard's going to be talking about the cross-platform configuration files. Jeff's going to be talking about shared code files, which is not mentioned here, but is also a deployment technology for making it possible to get your applications in a server environment running very efficiently. Lots of services can share the same program data without having to read it from disk. Jeff will talk about that. Okay, so in terms of developing competitive solutions, what are we doing there? Well, version 17.1 had very little new functionality. It still managed to be one of the latest Dyalog releases in history. Part of the reason for that was this HTML renderer that we've been trying to get to work reliably on all of these three platforms and package it with APL. That turned out to be a lot more difficult than we thought. We developed very little code, but packaging it and testing it and getting it to be reliable on all platforms was a significant challenge. We think that's really important. A lot of people are going to be writing service components that they integrate with other UI, but there's still going to be a need forever for APL developers to build a full stack thing where they've got at least a simple UI on top of a prototype. And the HTML renderer will allow you to develop, well, state-of-the-art UI if you use the right tools and deploy them on all of the platforms. Version 18.0 is going to have lots of new features and lots more visible work. Sort of invisible is the performance, but we recognize that performance is actually one of the most important things when it comes to your being competitive in the marketplace. Although the work done on performance isn't necessarily very visible, it's very important and something that we put work into in every release. In fact, this is work that was done in the version 17 timeframe mostly, but we decided not to put into version 17. It's stacked up for 18, and further work will be done in the 18 timeframe on performance. So we have another blue tsunami. Hopefully they don't contribute to warming of any kind. We've decided we finally have some ideas for date-time conversion tools. It's something we've been thinking about for decades. Finally, Richard thinks he knows what to do. He's going to be talking about that. And this sounds trivial, but again, it's something that happens, is used in almost every application in the world as tools to convert between uppercase, lowercase, or what is the word? The comparison case. And there's an APL to Excel project, so a tool that's going to allow you to create Excel spreadsheets from APL without having to have Excel available and start it up and use OLE automation. So this is going to work on Windows, on Linux, and on the Mac. And it's going to create XLSX files, which are zip files containing XML, using only APL code, except for the zipping. So there's quite a lot of talks in this area at this user meeting. Richard is it Christmas yet? Is about the dates. Marshall is going to be talking about performance in his talk on implementing reduction. Brian will be giving us an overview of what's new in the HTML renderer in this latest release. Josh is going to be talking about tools on top of the HTML render to help you develop HTML renderer UI. And Nathan is going to be talking, if he's able to connect to us from Denver via the internet, about the APL to Excel project. Okay, so integrating with application, integrating your solutions with applications and frameworks. In version 17.1, this is something that's actually been available experimentally for a while, but is now properly documented and packaged in 17.1. There's a way to take APL code and wrap it as a completely ordinary dynamic link library or shared object on all of the platforms. So where we've had good tools for doing this on Windows for decades, I think probably 3 decades if you go back to the earliest COM stuff, that only worked on Windows. Now you're going to be able to create linkable libraries on any platform. And of course, .NET is back. So the history of the .NET framework now, of course, is quite long. It originally appeared in 2002, and Dyalog back then had been invited, in fact, to participate in the design of parts of .NET, and were in the advanced wave of implementers. So just a few months after .NET became available, there was a special release of Dyalog APL 9.5, which supported .NET Framework 1.0. So the .NET Framework version numbers now, I believe, are up to version 4. But Microsoft has been working on really changing the way the .NET Framework is implemented. They've been working on, for many years, on something they call .NET Core, which was really targeted at mobile platforms, so tablets and phones. So that's been around for some years and is now up to, I believe, almost version 3.0, and the square turned into a circle. What Microsoft has now decided is they're going to have a new thing just called .NET 5. Correct me if I'm getting this wrong. It changes regularly, so there's no core and there's no framework. And the intention, Microsoft's intention, is to fold both of those into the same framework. And again, WLM, Windows, Linux, Mac. So the .NET framework is going to be available on all of those. And as John will talk about, I hope that's not too much of a spoiler, our intention is to support the .NET Core, or the .NET 5, sorry, got to get the terminology right, in version 18.0. And of course, the value of this, it makes a huge collection of libraries available for encryption and security and storage and everything related to the web available for APL application development. John will talk about that very soon. Okay, so a really big area of focus for us, we had workshops on this yesterday, is integrating with tools for source code management, building, testing, and deploying. So in version 17.1, the tool that's been around experimentally for a year called Link is now ready, we think, for the big time. It still has a couple of warts. Please help us remove them. But the intention is that Link will replace Salt as the recommended interface to source code manage, or to enable source code management in the future. And so that's for your applications. The next thing we're going to be looking at is packaging the APL interpreter up so that you can have the APL interpreter itself as part of your continuation integration pipelines, as the terminology is. So that means supporting things like Linux apt-get, and on Windows NuGet or NuGet, I'm not sure, probably NuGet, so that you can have new versions of Dyalog APL just seamlessly integrated when you are building at least experimental versions of your software. Okay, so Link is really important. I'll be back later today with Adam to talk about that. And the next steps that we see there is we need a way to implement APL packages, have a repository of APL packages. It's fine to have things on GitHub so that people can go and find the source, but you want to be able to say, I'm writing an application and I need the Dyalog cryptographic library, and just put that in a configuration file, and then automatically something will bring that into your environment. It's something people expect in any modern development environment, to be honest. Yep, and where for the last several years we've really been working hard ourselves to build these things, what we're really hoping, and we're starting to see the germs of, is being able to participate in open source projects with members of the community. Maybe fund them, at least, participate in design, work with people outside of Dyalog to produce these libraries. So Adam and I will be back later today. Paul Mansour, I've taken the liberty of including on this slide here. He's going to talk about a Git workflow, so tools that he's been working on to make his life easier once he started working with Git, how to manage the workflows. Maintaining the applications themselves, something we maybe haven't spent so much time on in the last couple of years. We've been focusing on other things, but it's, well, with the exception of the last one here. So the RIDE and the Windows development environment, those for the last couple of years, there have been some tweaks, but they've sort of settled down. They're moving on at a steady pace. So there's this nice little technology war, arms race now between the RIDE group and the Windows development environment that's driving little improvements on both sides. This is a screen. This is actually Windows Explorer, and showing the work that John has been doing to integrate previewers into the Windows. So if you just have a file system that contains some of these Dyalog source files, I think this is in a standard installation now. This will get set up on Windows. So if you just click on one of these files, then the same way you could preview a text file or a CSV file. This actually launches a runtime copy of Dyalog APL in the background and uses the editor to preview files. And there are little improvements like this, what are we calling this? Token highlighting. So if we put the cursor there on the if, it highlights the corresponding else and end if to make it easier for you to work. Little tweaks like that, nothing major. The thing that's really major, and an area where I think we're likely to spend significantly more time in the years to come, is making it possible to use third-party tools. This is something called VS Code, which has rapidly become one of the most popular development environments out there for C#, JavaScript, any programming language at all. So there are now add-ins for VS Code that allow you to edit APL code. And of course, the huge advantage of that is then that's seamlessly integrated with, in this case, we're looking at a Git repository. And we're looking at the list of commits. And I've expanded one of the commits. So there was a commit with the text file system watcher threading issue. And the file system watcher.apln namespace file was changed. I click on that. And VS Code, without any work being done on Dyalog's part, is correctly showing the APL code changes and works just fine with APL source code. So I now probably spend at least half of my time when I'm editing APL code in VS Code rather than in the Dyalog editor, because I'm always using GitHub. And the advantage of being able to have all of this in one place is huge. Of course, I am also using the tracer and editor on the side. Version 17.1, we've actually done a fair amount of this sort of invisible work to the APL programmer, but we've done a significant amount of work on making it easier to maintain the APL system itself. So where we've had this slightly weird patch workspace in the past, where you had to load a workspace and then it updated some of your executables. Sometime soon after the user meeting, we'll start issuing MSP files, which will be the same mechanism that just about any Windows application uses. It'll update all parts of your Dyalog Windows installation, not just the executables, also workspaces and other files if we decide to reissue them. On other platforms, it's always, I guess, been a bit simpler. You get these package files on Mac and Deb and RPMs on Linux, and you just reinstall them. They update everything. On the Raspberry Pi, we've been using the apt-get system, and we're hoping to eventually get that working on the other Linuxes as well. And for those of you who have internal audit departments or IT departments who want to be sure what it is you're installing on all the corporate machines, we're now, by default, signing all of the Windows executables. And of course, we make hashes and signatures available on the other platforms. Okay, so to summarize, version 17.1, not a lot of visible functionality, but a lot of work done on making APL easier to get hold of, easier to verify with the signatures, easier to maintain, and easier to integrate into processes and applications. Version 18.0 is going to be much more visible stuff. There'll be performance enhancements. There'll be the cross-platform .NET bridge. There'll be cross-platform configuration files. There'll be the ability to entirely have your Dyalog APL application written in source with no binary workspace required. There'll be new system functions if everything goes well in the development process. Of course, this is the user meeting. Before the release, some of these things may not happen. I hasten to add. Critical focus areas for us: source code management, packages, dependency management. One of the things we're finding, we now have customers working on really integrating into the cloud, and it looks like the hard problem to crack there is how you do authentication and security. So I think that's a focus area for us in the next year or two, is figuring out which of these interfaces we need to try and make available to you. There are things called OAuth, open authentication, OData for exchanging data, and so on. This is the $64 million question, understanding whether .NET 5 really is going to achieve widespread adoption and people will be happy to use it. You know, we all believed it was going to be Silverlight at one point, so we're all still a little bit nervous about these things. And of course, always performance. For you, if I may be bold as to suggest focus areas, get your source code into text files. Everything else gets easier after that. You get access to so many wonderful tools. And it doesn't have to change anything about how you develop and interactively debug APL code. This can be achieved with no change to our inalienable way of life. Think about how you're going to add encryption and security to your applications, because eventually somebody's going to demand that you put it on the cloud, and then you'll have to know how to do that. And take apprentices. I mean, I'm hoping some of the new first-timers here are people who've been recently hired to do work in APL. Well, I know that some of them are, because at Dyalog we have, as I mentioned, Richard Park joined us last year, and he's working on documentation, samples, webinars. We've just started a consulting team in the US. So there are Dyalog consultants. Josh, who is here and will be speaking, and is a previous winner of the Dyalog problem-solving contest. Nathan, who came to us through the APL Orchard and is not here, he's in Denver, and he's involved in a theater production, which I understand involves tango. And they have shows this month, so he couldn't physically be here, but he is going to be doing a talk on the Excel interface if we get the technology to work. And we are actively recruiting. We are interviewing people, people coming to see us for a new C developer job before the end of the year. Yep, and to wrap up, a world premiere. So one of the things I really enjoy about the APL community is that it's full of talented people whose talents go beyond programming. And we, as you know, have been running webinars for some time, and this has inspired one of our users to write us a jingle, because webinars should have jingles. So here is the Dyalog Jingle. This is the long version. Lasts about a minute, so you can think of questions. And plan to come to webinars. So you can hear it again. Thank you, Stefano. Inspired by Odin's 2 ravens who go out into the world to seek news and bring them back to us, and then we do webinars based on what we learn. So I think I actually left time for 3 minutes worth of questions. I realize this is a shock to people. So probably nobody prepared any. Are you wanting me to go and stand here? Oh, people should come and stand here. But it doesn't look like there are any. Oh, there is one. Diane. I'll go back over here then.
Could you speak a little more about the patch system? So we are in an environment in which our users can't patch themselves. So we have one central user who patches and then deploys on the network. Yep. So could you speak a little bit more about how that will work?
So I imagine that in that scenario, that person who has the rights, who does the distribution, will be installing our patches and then deploying it using whatever mechanism they normally do. I assume at the moment they use the patch system. Yep. They patch executables and then yep. they put them somewhere where people can do the install. Yep.
Right. I was just curious about your comment that it was not just patching the executables anymore, it was patching other things. And yep. so I wanted to understand what those other things were and how would that work in this network environment. So what are the other things that are going to get patched?
Well, it'll be any file that's in the Dyalog distribution. So it'll be the help files and the workspaces and the script files and so on. So I imagine your IT person is going to be patching their model system and then redistributing from that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, in that case, I guess John gets 1 extra minute to tell us about the core. Thank you.